Libra, welcome back, my beautiful souls. I'm so happy you're here. As always, this is a general reading, so take what resonates and leave what doesn't. Today's energy feels different. It feels quiet, but not because nothing is happening. It feels quiet because someone has been doing a lot of thinking behind the scenes. The more I sit with this energy, the more I feel someone looking back at the past in a way they never did before. They're replaying conversations, they're replaying moments, and honestly, it feels like they're finally seeing things from a completely different perspective. So let's take a look and see what the cards want to reveal about this connection and the person who can't seem to stop thinking about you. Okay, Libra, right away, this energy feels heavy, not in a dramatic way, not in a chaotic way. It feels heavy because someone is carrying around thoughts they can't seem to put down. The first thing that catches my attention is justice. And honestly, the moment I see justice sitting here, I don't immediately think about consequences. I think about realization. I think about someone finally being honest with themselves after spending a very long time avoiding the truth. It's almost like this person has reached a point where they can no longer tell themselves the same story they've been repeating for months, maybe even years. Because the more I look at this energy, the more I feel someone revisiting old memories. And then we have the Six of Cups showing up. This is interesting because these memories don't feel random. They're not just remembering you because they're lonely. They're remembering specific moments. The way you looked at them when they were struggling. The way you stayed patient when they pulled away. The way you kept trying to understand them, even when they weren't making it easy. It's like these memories are coming back one after another, and this person can't escape them. They keep seeing pieces of you everywhere. A conversation, a joke, a place, a song, a small moment they didn't appreciate enough at the time. And honestly, Libra, I think that's what's hitting them the hardest. Not what they lost, but what they failed to recognize while they still had it. Because I keep hearing this energy say, why didn't I see it then? Why didn't I understand what they were trying to give me? Why did I keep focusing on everything else except the one thing that actually mattered? And I feel like that's where the Hermit comes in. Because this person doesn't feel distracted anymore. They don't feel busy anymore. They don't feel consumed by outside opinions anymore. It's almost like life forced them into a quieter space. A space where there are no excuses, no noise, no distractions. Just them and their thoughts. And the more time they've spent in that space, the more difficult it has become to ignore what happened between the two of you. Honestly, I don't even think they're looking at the situation the same way anymore. Because before, they may have focused on what scared them, what felt uncertain, what felt risky, what felt complicated. But now they're looking at your perspective. And that's something they weren't willing to do before. They're beginning to understand how confusing their actions must have felt. How painful their silence may have been. How many times you probably extended understanding when they gave very little in return. And Libra, I have to be honest. I feel guilt here. Not the kind of guilt that disappears after a day or two. This feels deeper than that. Because when someone truly begins to see their own behavior clearly, there's usually a period where they have to sit with it. And that's exactly what this feels like. They're sitting with it. They're thinking about it. They're replaying everything. And every time they do, another piece of the puzzle falls into place. Then we have judgment. Okay, this is where the energy starts shifting. Because something inside this person is waking up. Something they've been avoiding. Something they've been suppressing. Something they've been pushing aside because facing it would require them to admit that they made mistakes. And I keep feeling this moment where they're looking back and realizing that you were carrying much more of this connection than they ever acknowledged. You were trying to build. You were trying to understand. You were trying to create stability. And meanwhile, they were caught up in fears, confusion, doubts, or whatever was happening inside of them. The realization is becoming impossible to ignore. And honestly, Libra, I don't think this person is proud of what they're seeing. Because every new realization seems to come with another wave of regret. Not because they're sitting around feeling sorry for themselves, but because they're beginning to understand the impact of their actions. They're beginning to understand that certain wounds didn't happen by accident. Certain distances didn't appear overnight. Certain walls weren't built without reason. And the more clarity they gain, the more they seem to recognize your value. Not just your presence, your value, the effort, the patience, the loyalty, the emotional maturity. The things they may have overlooked because they were focused on everything else. And I keep getting this image of someone staring at an old message, an old photo, or simply sitting alone with their thoughts, realizing that the story they told themselves about this connection may not have been the whole truth after all. Because what keeps coming through is this growing awareness that maybe things were never as one-sided as they convinced themselves they were. Maybe Libra was trying harder than they realized. Maybe Libra understood more than they admitted. Maybe Libra deserved more than they gave. And the deeper they go into these reflections, the harder it becomes to pretend they don't feel what they feel. Because something is changing here, something is softening, and the silence that once felt comfortable is starting to feel much heavier than it used to. Because the more this person sits with themselves, the more they begin to realize that silence has been carrying a weight of its own. And honestly, Libra, that's where things start getting uncomfortable for them. Because I keep seeing the moon sitting here, and the energy around it feels incredibly private, almost secretive. Not because this person was trying to deceive you in some grand dramatic way, but because there were feelings they never knew how to put into words. Feelings they kept locked away. Feelings they convinced themselves would eventually disappear if they ignored them long enough. But they didn't. In fact, they seem stronger now than they were before. It's almost like every emotion this person tried to bury found its way back to the surface. And that's what they're struggling with. Not the existence of these emotions, the fact that they can no longer pretend they don't exist. Okay, this is interesting because I keep feeling someone who spent a very long time trying to appear unaffected, trying to appear logical, trying to appear in control. Meanwhile, underneath all of that, there was an entire emotional world they refused to acknowledge. And the deeper I go into this energy, the more I feel fear. Not fear of you, fear of vulnerability, fear of being truly seen. Because once somebody allows another person to see their heart completely, there is no hiding anymore. There are no defense left. And I think that terrified them more than they ever admitted. The Seven of Swords is coming through here, and honestly, what I'm feeling isn't somebody trying to escape you. It feels more like somebody trying to escape themselves, trying to avoid difficult conversations, trying to avoid uncomfortable truths, trying to avoid the emotions that kept following them wherever they went. Because every time they got close to understanding what they truly felt, they found another distraction, another reason, another excuse, another wall. But walls can only protect someone for so long before they start feeling like a prison. And that's exactly what this energy feels like. The mask is becoming exhausting. The pretending is becoming exhausting. The emotional distance is becoming exhausting. And I keep hearing this person say something like, I'm tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. Tired of carrying things they never expressed. Tired of holding back words they should have said a long time ago. Tired of wondering what might have happened if they had simply been honest. Because honesty keeps showing up all over this reading. Not just honesty with you, honesty with themselves. And that's where King of Cups enters the picture. The moment I see this card, I don't see someone who suddenly has everything figured out. I see someone who is finally sitting with their emotions instead of running from them. Somebody who is beginning to understand that feelings don't disappear simply because they're ignored. In fact, the longer they remain unspoken, the heavier they become. And Libra, I think this person has been carrying those feelings for much longer than anyone realizes. There may have been moments when they appeared detached, moments when they appeared cold, moments when they acted as though nothing affected them. But underneath that surface, there was always more happening, always more feeling, always more confusion, always more longing than they allowed themselves to show. And honestly, I think one of the biggest realizations they're having right now is understanding how much energy they've spent protecting themselves from experiences that could have actually brought them happiness. Because when I look at this connection, I don't see somebody who never cared. I see somebody who cared so much that it frightened them. And those are very different things. The problem is that fear has a way of disguising itself. Sometimes it looks like avoidance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like distance. And sometimes it looks like somebody convincing themselves they don't need something that they secretly want more than anything. Strength is sitting here now. And what strikes me about this card is that the courage they're being asked to find isn't external. It's internal. The courage to admit the truth. The courage to stop hiding. The courage to stop pretending they don't feel what they feel. Because every time they imagine speaking honestly, something inside them starts shaking. What if they're misunderstood? What if it's too late? What if they can't explain themselves properly? What if the words come out wrong? You know, those questions seem to circle around this person constantly, and yet, despite all those fears, I still see movement happening inside them. Small at first, almost invisible, but it's there. The emotional walls aren't as solid as they used to be. The defenses aren't working the way they once did. The stories they've been telling themselves are beginning to crack. And through those cracks, Something much more authentic is trying to emerge. I keep feeling this urge to confess. Not necessarily every secret at once. Not some dramatic speech. Just honesty. Simple honesty. The kind that begins with, "There's something I need you to know," because there are truths this person has carried for a very long time. Truths about how they felt. Truths about why they pulled away. Truths about the fears that influence so many of their choices. And the closer they get to facing those truths themselves, the harder it becomes to imagine keeping them hidden forever. Because somewhere deep down, they're beginning to understand that the version of themselves who stayed silent isn't the version of themselves they want to be anymore. Something about this energy feels different from before. Not softer, not easier, just clearer. You know how sometimes a person spends so much time fighting themselves that they eventually become exhausted by their own resistance? That's what this feels like. The struggle isn't between you and them anymore. The struggle is happening entirely inside of them. And honestly, Libra, I think that's why justice has returned to the reading. The moment this card appears again, I get the feeling that somebody is starting to examine their life through a completely different lens. They're looking at choices they made years ago. They're looking at situations they defended, people they listened to, opinions they allowed to influence them. And for the first time, they're asking themselves a very uncomfortable question. What if everyone wasn't right? Because there was a period where this person seemed to trust everybody else's voice more than their own. Family, friends, outside influences, expectations, responsibilities, fear, all of it blended together until they could barely hear themselves think. And somewhere in that noise, their heart got pushed into the background, not because it disappeared, because they stopped listening to it. Okay, this is interesting, because Ace of Swords is sitting here, and what I keep hearing is clarity. Not clarity about you, clarity about themselves. That's the difference. I think for a long time then this person believed they understood who they were. They believed they understood what they wanted. They believed they were making logical decisions. But the deeper they look at everything, the more they realize many of those decisions were being made from fear. Fear of change, fear of vulnerability, fear of disappointing people, fear of being judged, fear of choosing a path that looked different from what everyone expected. And honestly, fear has been driving this person's life for much longer than they realized. The strange thing is that when somebody lives in fear long enough, it starts to feel normal. It starts to feel practical. It starts to feel responsible. But eventually something happens. Eventually the heart gets tired of being ignored. And that's exactly where this person seems to be. Because I don't feel somebody who wants to keep pretending anymore. I feel somebody who is beginning to understand that living for other people's approval comes with a price, and that price is authenticity. The star is coming through now. The energy around this card feels incredibly emotional, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just honest. Like somebody standing under an open sky and finally allowing themselves to admit what they've been carrying. Because the more I sit with this card, the more I feel hope returning to them. Not because every problem has disappeared, not because everything suddenly makes sense, but because they're starting to trust themselves again. And honestly, Libra, that may be one of the biggest shifts happening here. This person stopped trusting their own hearts somewhere along the way. They kept looking outside themselves for answers, looking outside themselves for permission, looking outside themselves for validation. And every time they did, they moved further away from what they actually felt. But something is changing. It's almost like they're beginning to reconnect with a forgotten part of themselves. The part that knew what was important. The part that recognized genuine connection. The part that wasn't afraid to love. And I have to say, this feels incredibly personal. Because the realization isn't just about losing something valuable. It's about recognizing that they abandoned their own truth in the process. Judgment is appearing again. Honestly, every time this card shows up in a reading like this, I pay attention. Because it feels like another layer is being peeled away, another illusion falling apart, another excuse losing its power. And what I'm seeing here is somebody having a series of realizations that cannot be undone. Once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. Once you acknowledge something honestly, you can't unknow it. That's where they are. The awareness keeps growing. The understanding keeps growing. The emotional maturity keeps growing, and it's forcing them to confront parts of themselves they've avoided for a very long time. I keep getting this image of somebody sitting alone after a long day. No distractions, no conversations, no noise, just silence. And in that silence, their thoughts keep drifting back to the same place. Not because they're trying to force it, because their heart keeps leading them there. The thing about this person is that they're starting to recognize a pattern. Every decision they made out of fear brought temporary comfort, but it never brought peace. Every decision they made to satisfy other people created distance between them and their own happiness. And they're beginning to see that, really see it. The old version of themselves would have kept running, kept rationalizing, kept convincing themselves everything was fine. But this version feels different. This version is asking harder questions. This version wants honest answers. This version wants a life that actually reflects what they feel instead of what everybody else expects. And Libra, I think that's why the energy feels so significant. Because for the first time, this person doesn't seem focused on what everybody else might think. They seem focused on whether they're being truthful with themselves. And once someone reaches that point, the entire direction of their life can begin to change. Because the heart they've been trying so hard to silence is no longer whispering. It's getting louder, and every day it becomes a little harder for them to pretend they can't hear it. A picture keeps forming in my mind as I look at these cards. Not a dramatic picture, not some grand romantic scene, just something simple. Two people sitting together and feeling at peace. And honestly, Libra, that may be what surprises this person the most. Because I don't think they're being pulled toward intensity anymore. They're being pulled toward stability. The energy shifts the moment the Two of Cups appears. The atmosphere feels calmer, more mature, more grounded. It's almost like this person has stopped looking at this connection through the lens of uncertainty and started looking at it through the lens of possibility. For a long time, they seemed focused on all the reasons something might not work, all the complications, all the differences, all the risks. But something inside them is beginning to ask a different question. What if this connection wasn't the problem? What if this connection was actually one of the healthiest things they've ever experienced? Okay, that's a very different mindset. Because when someone moves from questioning whether they should care to questioning why they resisted caring in the first place, everything starts changing. And I feel like that's where this person is. They're no longer evaluating you as some temporary chapter. They're no longer looking at this as a passing emotional experience. The deeper they reflect, the more they realize you've become part of the future they keep imagining. And honestly, I don't even know if they expected that. Because every time they picture their life moving forward, your presence keeps appearing, not in a forced way. Not because they're trying to make it happen. It just happens naturally. And that realization seems to be catching them off guard. The Empress is sitting here, and the energy surrounding it feels incredibly warm. There's something about the way this person views you that has changed. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that they're finally allowing themselves to see what was already there. Because when they think about you, they don't just think about attraction. They don't just think about chemistry. They think about comfort. They think about support. They think about emotional safety. They think about somebody who brought a sense of calm into situations that otherwise felt chaotic. And I keep feeling them revisit moments where you showed up for them in ways they never properly acknowledged. Small things, subtle things, the kind of things that often go unnoticed until they're no longer there. A conversation that helped them through a difficult day. A reassuring message, a moment of understanding, a moment of patience, a moment when you chose compassion instead of judgment. Those memories seem to carry a completely different weight now. Because they're beginning to understand that those moments were never ordinary. They were rare. And honestly, Libra, I think that's why the emotional tone of this reading keeps becoming softer, not weaker, softer. The defenses are lowering. The need to control everything is lowering, and in its place, there's a growing appreciation for what this connection actually provided. 10 of Cups is appearing now, and the first thing I hear is this person asking themselves what happiness really means, because I think they spent years chasing versions of success that looked impressive from the outside. Achievements, responsibilities, expectations, goals. But somewhere along the way, they forgot to ask whether those things actually fulfilled them. And as strange as it sounds, I think you've become part of that realization. Not because you're responsible for their happiness, but because being around you made them feel something they couldn't find elsewhere. A sense of ease, a sense of belonging, a sense that they didn't have to perform or prove themselves constantly. You know? There's something beautiful about that. Because the more authentic a connection is, the less effort it takes to be yourself inside of it. And that's what keeps coming through. This person remembers feeling more like themselves when they were with you. More relaxed, more open, more present, more honest. And they're starting to understand how valuable that really is. Especially after spending so much time trying to fit into environments that never truly felt aligned with who they were. The Six of Pentacles is showing up here. And what immediately catches my attention is balance. Not perfect balance, not fantasy, Real balance. The kind that's built slowly over time. The kind that's built through consistency, through effort, through mutual respect. And I feel like this person is becoming very aware of that. They're thinking about reciprocity. They're thinking about contribution. They're thinking about what it actually means to show up for someone. Because the version of this connection they're imagining doesn't involve one person carrying everything. It doesn't involve one person constantly giving while the other remains emotionally unavailable. The image forming here feels different. It feels like somebody wanting to meet you halfway, somebody wanting to participate, somebody wanting to contribute. And honestly, Libra, that feels significant. Because I don't think they're focused on grand gestures. I think they're focused on sustainability. They're focused on trust. They're focused on creating something that actually lasts. And trust keeps coming up repeatedly. Not because trust is fully restored, because they understand its value now. They understand that trust isn't built through words alone. It's built through actions, through consistency, through presence, through choosing the connection repeatedly rather than occasionally. And the more they reflect on everything, the more they seem to realize that what they want isn't excitement for a moment. It's peace for the long run. It's waking up beside someone they genuinely respect. It's sharing life with someone who understands them. It's knowing that when life becomes difficult, there's still somebody standing beside them. That's the future they seem to be seeing. Not some fantasy, not some illusion, something much more real than that. Something that feels surprisingly simple. And perhaps that's why it feels so important to them. Because after all the noise, all the confusion, and all the uncertainty they've carried for so long, the idea of choosing what feels genuine is starting to look more appealing than anything else. A feeling of urgency starts creeping into the reading here. Not panic, not pressure, just that unmistakable sense that something can no longer remain unsaid. You know how there are moments in life when a person realizes they've been carrying a conversation inside their head for far too long? That's exactly what this feels like. Because the Eight of Wands appears, and immediately I get the sense that this person is becoming restless. Restless with silence, restless with distance, restless with all the unfinished thoughts they've been holding on to. And honestly, Libra, I don't think they're only thinking about reaching out. I think they're thinking about what they would actually say if they did, because there's a difference. Anyone can send a message. Anyone can break a period of silence. But opening your heart, explaining yourself honestly, taking responsibility, that's a completely different thing. And that's where this energy becomes interesting. Because I keep seeing somebody rehearsing conversations, driving somewhere and thinking about what they wish they had said. Lying awake at night, replaying moments, imagining different outcomes, imagining different words. Not because they're trying to control the future, because they're finally acknowledging how much was left unresolved. The Ace of Wands catches my attention next, and what strikes me about this card is the courage that's beginning to emerge. Not perfect courage, not fearless courage, just enough courage to start moving. Because for a long time, this person waited for certainty. They waited until they felt completely ready. They waited until every fear disappeared. They waited until every question had an answer. But life rarely works that way. And I think they're starting to understand that. Some conversations happen because you're ready. Other conversations happen because staying silent becomes even harder. This person feels caught between those two realities. Part of them still worries. Part of them still hesitates. But another part seems increasingly determined to stop hiding behind uncertainty. And honestly, Libra, I think that's why the emotional tone feels so genuine. There doesn't seem to be an agenda here. No games, no strategy, no performance. Just somebody wanting to speak honestly. Somebody wanting to be understood. Somebody wanting the chance to explain things that never made sense from the outside. Because when I sit with this energy, I keep hearing, you never knew the whole story. Not because they intentionally tried to deceive you, because they didn't even understand parts of themselves at the time. How could they explain something they hadn't fully faced? How could they communicate emotions they were actively running from? That's why this feels different. They're no longer standing in the same place emotionally. The perspective has changed. The awareness has changed. And with that change comes a growing desire to share what they've learned. Queen of Cups is appearing here. And honestly, the energy around this card feels incredibly tender. It's almost like every defensive layer that once existed is beginning to soften. Because the way they think about you feels emotional, not idealized, not unrealistic. Emotional, there's a warmth here, a genuine affection, a level of care that survived periods of confusion, distance, and silence. And I think that's part of what surprises them. The feelings didn't disappear. Life changed, circumstances changed, people changed. But whenever their thoughts find their way back to you, the emotional connection still feels real, still feels meaningful, still feels alive. You know, there are some people who leave our lives and eventually become memories. And there are other people who somehow remain emotionally present no matter how much time passes. This connection feels closer to that second category, because every time they try to understand why they still care, they keep arriving at the same conclusion. You mattered, maybe more than they allowed themselves to admit, maybe more than they were prepared for, maybe more than they understood at the time. Judgment appears again. And honestly, I had a feeling this card wasn't finished speaking. Because every time it returns, another realization follows. Another truth surfaces. Another piece of denial falls away. And what I keep seeing is somebody standing face to face with themselves. Not with their fears. Not with outside opinions. Not with expectations. With themselves. And that's a powerful moment. Because once somebody reaches that level of honesty, the excuses start disappearing. The blame starts disappearing. The confusion starts disappearing. What's left is accountability. What's left is authenticity. What's left is a desire to move differently than before. And Libra, I think this person understands something important now. An apology isn't just saying, "I'm sorry." It's understanding why the apology matters. It's recognizing how actions affected somebody else. It's recognizing the weight of choices, the consequences of silence, the impact of absence. And I think that's why whatever they want to express feels so personal. Because this isn't only about explaining what happened. It's about acknowledging your experience of what happened. For perhaps the first time, they seem willing to step outside their own perspective completely and consider what everything may have felt like from your side. And that's not an easy thing for anyone to do, especially when it forces them to confront moments they wish they could change. Moments they wish they had handled differently. Moments they wish they had been brave enough to speak. A quiet image keeps appearing as I look at these final cards. Someone standing at the edge of a bridge they've spent a long time staring at. Not crossing, just staring, wondering, questioning, thinking. The bridge is still there. The distance still exists. The uncertainty still exists. But something has changed inside the person standing at that edge. Because they're no longer asking themselves whether the connection mattered. They're no longer asking themselves whether the feelings were real. They're no longer asking themselves whether they should keep pretending. The questions they're carrying now feel very different. And the closer they move toward those answers, the more difficult it becomes to keep everything locked away inside. Libra, one thing feels very clear to me before we close this reading. Some people spend years running from what they feel, but eventually the heart has a way of bringing us back to the lessons we were meant to learn. Whatever is unfolding behind the scenes, this person doesn't seem to be looking at this connection the way they once did. And sometimes that realization alone can change everything. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your energy with me today. I truly appreciate your time, your kindness, and your support more than you know. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and trust yourself above all else. I'll see you in the next reading, my beautiful Libra. Until then, take care and be gentle with yourself. Bye.